The moment Esther Grady found out, she could not breathe. She stood in the center of Caldwell, Kansas's town hall, the autumn of 1883, pressing its cold fingers through every gap in the wooden walls, and she stared at the chair. The plain, ladder-back chair in the third row, second from the aisle, with the small square of faded red ribbon tied to its right armrest. She had sat in that chair every single month for the past year. Every single month she had walked in and found it empty, waiting, as though the town itself had reserved it for her. She had assumed it was simply luck. She had assumed the citizens of Caldwell were polite enough not to take a seat that someone was clearly already settled into. She had assumed wrong. "That's his chair, you know." The voice belonged to Mavis Holloway, a round-faced woman with steel-gray hair and eyes like a hawk that had seen everything twice. She spoke from beside Esther with the calm confidence of someone delivering news that was obvious to everyone except the person receiving it. "Sheriff Ashford. He ties that ribbon there before every meeting. Has done it all year, ever since you moved to town." The blood drained from Esther's face so fast she felt lightheaded. "He what?" she said, and her voice came out thin as paper. Mavis tilted her head, her expression softening just a fraction. "Nobody warned you, I suppose. We all just figured you knew, or that you'd figure it out eventually." She paused, her gaze drifting toward the front of the hall where Sheriff Joel Ashford stood with his back to the room, talking quietly with the town mayor. "He comes in 2 hours before every meeting starts, sets that ribbon, makes sure no one touches it. Then he leaves and comes back when everyone else does, so it doesn't look obvious." Esther's hands had gone cold. She pressed them flat against the front of her skirt to keep them from shaking. A year. He had done this for a year. 12 meetings, 12 ribbons, 12 mornings when she had walked into this hall and settled into what she believed was coincidence, and the entire town had apparently watched this unfold in real time and said absolutely nothing. She felt a rush of something enormous that she could not immediately name. It was not quite anger, though anger was wrapped up in it. It was not quite gratitude, though that was tangled in there too. It was something rawer than both of those things combined. It was the sensation of having your world rearranged without your permission, of discovering that someone has been watching over you quietly, faithfully, without expectation or announcement, for a full year of your life. She turned to look at Joel Ashford's back, the broad shoulders under his dark coat, the silver star on his chest catching the lamplight, the way he held his hat in his right hand and tilted his head when he was listening carefully to someone. She had known this man. She had sat next to his empty chair month after month, and she had known him, or thought she had. She had spoken to him in the street. She had bought coffee at the general store while he leaned against the counter. She had watched him handle disputes and calm frightened horses, and carry elderly Mrs. Patterson's market basket without being asked. She had cataloged these things about him the way you catalog things about a person you are trying very hard not to fall in love with. And all along, he had been tying a ribbon to a chair. She was going to have to go back to the very beginning to understand how she had gotten here, and why that ribbon on that chair felt like the most consequential thing she had ever seen in her 26 years of living. Esther Grady had arrived in Caldwell, Kansas in the October of 1882 with a trunk full of books, a box of sewing supplies, $43 in cash money, and a quantity of determination that several people later described as alarming. She had come from St. Louis, which was not as sophisticated as St. Louis liked to believe it was, but was considerably more familiar to her than the flat, wind-scoured prairie she stepped out onto when the train stopped at Caldwell's modest station. She was 25 years old. She was not particularly tall, but she carried herself as though she were, which amounted to much the same thing. She had dark brown hair that she kept pinned up with the sort of efficiency that suggested she did not have time to fuss with it, and gray eyes that people tended to find unsettling until they realized that the expression behind them was not coldness, but rather an extremely focused attention. She noticed things. She always had. It was a quality that had served her well and gotten her into trouble in roughly equal measure. She had come to Caldwell because her uncle, a man named Gerald Grady who ran a small dry goods store, had written to tell her that he needed help with his accounts and that the town was decent and growing and that she would not starve. He had not mentioned that he was sicker than he let on, or that the accounts were in worse shape than he implied. He had not mentioned that 3 months after her arrival he would die quietly in his sleep of a heart that had simply worked itself out, leaving her the store, the debt attached to it, and no particular plan for the future. She had stayed anyway. She stayed because she had already spent $25 on the train fare and the rest on supplies, and she did not have enough money to go back. She stayed because her options in St. Louis had not been vastly superior. She stayed because there was something about the wide, flat sky over the Kansas plains that she found, despite herself, quietly magnificent. And she stayed because on the day after her uncle's funeral, when she was standing outside the store in a state of numb overwhelm, a man had walked by and stopped and said, without preamble or fuss, that he was sorry for her loss, and that if she needed anything the sheriff's office was 2 streets over and always had coffee on. That man had been Joel Ashford. She had not known he was the sheriff then. He was not wearing his badge. He was carrying a bridle and a paper sack of feed, and he looked like a man who had things to do and had nonetheless chosen to stop and say the right thing at the right moment. He had dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that needed shaving and eyes the particular color of coffee with just a drop of cream, a warm brownish amber that caught the light in a way that she registered, and then firmly filed away under the category of irrelevant observations. "Thank you," she had said. "Joel Ashford," he had replied and offered his hand. "Esther Grady," she had said and shaken it. That had been the whole of their first conversation. 30 words maybe, 2 names. One moment of uncomplicated human kindness on a cold October morning on the main street of a small Kansas cattle town. She had gone inside and gotten to work on the accounts, and she had not thought about the color of his eyes for at least 3 days. The store was called Grady's, which was convenient since she was in fact a Grady. It sold dry goods, fabric, thread, flour, sugar, canned goods, lamp oil, tools, rope, and an assortment of other necessaries that a frontier town required in steady supply. Her uncle had been a fair businessman with poor organizational skills, and Esther had better organizational skills than most people she had ever met, so the transition was painful but manageable. She spent the first month working 18-hour days, reorganizing the stockroom, renegotiating her supplier arrangements, and learning the names and habits of every customer who came through the door. Caldwell was a cattle town on the Kisham Trail, which meant it was busy during drive season and quieter in the off months. The population hovered around 1,500 souls, including the surrounding farms and ranches. It had a newspaper, 3 churches, 2 saloons, a doctor's office, a lawyer, a school, and a town hall where monthly meetings were held to discuss civic matters. It also had a sheriff's office with 2 deputies, a jail that was usually occupied, and a man named Joel Ashford who ran it all with what the townsfolk universally described as a quiet competence that somehow communicated itself without him ever having to raise his voice. Esther learned about Joel Ashford the way you learn about gravity, gradually, and mostly through observation, until you suddenly realize it has been operating on you the whole time. She learned that he had been sheriff for 4 years and had the town's wholehearted approval, which was not a small thing in a cattle town, where the trail drives brought in cowhands who were tired and thirsty, and inclined toward the kind of trouble that emptied a man's wages in a single night. She learned that he had come from Colorado originally, that he had served briefly as a deputy in Dodge City before coming to Caldwell, and that he lived alone in a small house at the edge of town with a horse named Consequence and a dog named Bracket. She learned these things over coffee at the general store and through conversations at the feed store and via the remarkably efficient information network that existed among the women of Caldwell, which was more reliable than the telegraph and considerably faster. She also learned, in pieces and over time, about the darker things. She learned that 3 years before she arrived, a man named Cord Vance had come into Caldwell, running a land scheme that had bilked several ranching families out of significant money. She learned that Joel had uncovered the scheme, arrested Vance, and shepherded the case through the territorial court with enough care and patience that the families recovered most of their losses. She learned that Vance had sworn to make him pay for it, and that nobody in town took the threat seriously except Joel himself, who simply became more careful without becoming afraid. She learned that there had been a woman once, some years before, a schoolteacher named Clara Birch, who had come to Caldwell and stayed 2 years before marrying a banker from Wichita and leaving. People described this with a certain delicacy that told Esther more than the actual words did. They described it as a thing that had not ended happily. She filed this away, too, in the category of things that mattered and that she was not going to ask about directly. The first town meeting Esther attended was in November of 1882, 6 weeks after she arrived. She went because she was now a business owner, and the meeting was going to cover the question of road improvements on the main thoroughfare, which affected her deliveries. And so it was a practical matter rather than a social one, which was how she justified to herself the fact that she was still not entirely comfortable walking into rooms full of strangers. She had arrived a few minutes late, flustered from closing up the store, and the hall was already filling. She had scanned the room for an empty seat and found one in the third row, second from the aisle. There was no ribbon on it then. She sat down, pulled out a small notebook, and listened to 45 minutes of debate about the road, during which she made 3 observations that she ultimately kept to herself, because she did not yet know enough about local politics to judge whether speaking would help or harm. Joel Ashford sat at the front of the hall with the mayor and the town council, as the sheriff was apparently expected to do. He had his badge on. He looked the same as he had looked in the street, except with less bridle and more paperwork. At some point during the discussion of drainage ditches, he glanced toward the back of the room and his eyes landed on her briefly, with a quality of attention that made her look down at her notebook. She did not think about it afterward. She was very firm about that. The second meeting was in December. She arrived on time and found the third row, second from the aisle seat, empty again. She sat in it again because it was a good seat, close enough to hear clearly, far enough back to observe the whole room. This time she did speak once, when the question of a new town ordinance regarding the storage of flammable materials came up. She had a practical concern because she stored lamp oil in her back room and wanted to know whether the proposed ordinance would require structural changes to her building. Her question was clear and specific, and Joel Ashford, who was answering questions from the floor, looked at her for a moment before answering in a way that addressed her concern directly rather than giving her the vague reassurance she had half expected. Structures already in compliance with current practice won't need modification unless they expand their storage volume, he had said. If you're worried about a specific situation, come by the office and we can walk through it. She had nodded and written it down. She had not gone by the office. January was bitterly cold. The meeting was sparsely attended, which she supposed was understandable given that getting to town required braving a wind that had apparently blown directly from the Arctic Circle without stopping for pleasantries anywhere in between. She had arrived wrapped in her heaviest coat and found the third row seat empty. She sat in it. She noticed this time a very faint mark on the armrest, as though something had been tied there and removed recently. She had not thought much of it. February, the same. March, she had spoken twice, and Joel Ashford had responded to both of her comments with that same quality of direct and respectful attention that she had noticed before, and that she was becoming, against her better judgment, slightly addicted to. She had a theory, which she had not shared with anyone, that the measure of a man in a position of authority was how he treated questions from people who had no particular power to reward or punish him. Joel Ashford treated questions from all quarters with equal seriousness. He was doing it now in March as he had done in November, and she noted this with the same careful attention she gave to everything. She also noticed in March that he came to the meetings and sat at the front with the council, but that his hat always ended up on the back of his chair in a way that suggested it had been elsewhere recently. She noticed that he arrived at the hall slightly breathless in March, as though he had been somewhere else immediately before. She did not connect these observations to anything. She was simply observing, which was what she did. By April, she had largely stabilized the store's finances. She had hired a part-time assistant named Ruth Keller, a 16-year-old girl from one of the farming families outside town who was quick and reliable, and who treated Esther's organizational systems with a respect that suggested she had been personally wronged by disorder. The store was doing reasonably well. Esther was beginning to feel like she might actually survive this adventure. She had also, by April, begun to look forward to the town meetings in a way she was careful to attribute entirely to civic engagement. It was not that she was looking forward to a specific person. It was that she found the meetings stimulating. They were a forum where things were discussed and decided, where problems were identified and addressed, where the community came together to work out how to coexist and improve. These were things she genuinely valued. And if the discussions were occasionally made more interesting by the fact that one of the participants had the conversational habit of absolute directness combined with the rare quality of actually listening before he spoke, well, that was simply an observation, not a feeling. In May, there had been an incident. A man named Delbert Marsh, who owned a sizable piece of land north of town and considered himself the sort of person who deserved to be agreed with regularly, had said something at the meeting that was both factually wrong and condescending in its delivery, regarding a proposal about water rights that affected several small landowners. Esther had a particular and visceral intolerance for the combination of wrongness and condescension. She had said so, in clear and specific terms, with documentation from the relevant territorial statute, that she had looked up at the newspaper office 2 days before the meeting, because she had suspected this topic would come up. The silence that followed had been the particular kind of silence that exists when a room full of people is collectively recalibrating. Delbert Marsh had gone very red. The mayor had looked at the ceiling, and Joel Ashford from the front of the room had said, in a voice that was entirely level and contained something she could not quite identify at the time, "Miss Grady's reading of the statute is correct. The proposal stands as written." She had written in her notebook and not looked up. She had felt, however, something warm and specific in the center of her chest, which she also filed away under the category of irrelevant observations, where the folder was getting somewhat full. June brought the summer heat in earnest, and a meeting focused on the upcoming cattle drive season, which was Caldwell's economic heartbeat and logistical nightmare simultaneously. The drives brought money and trouble in roughly equal portions, and the meeting was long and contentious, and Esther sat in her usual seat and listened to 3 hours of debate about ordinance enforcement and saloon hours, and the management of trail camp sites outside town. It was after this meeting, in the cooling blue of a June evening, that Joel Ashford had first walked her back to the store. She had been leaving when her notebook slipped from under her arm and landed in the dirt, scattering several pages of notes. He had been the nearest person and had bent to help her collect them before she could protest that she had it, and in the process of handing the pages back had looked at her notes and said, "You cross-reference things." "I do," she had said. "I do too," he had said. That had apparently been sufficient grounds for him to walk beside her the 2 blocks to her store, during which they had spoken about the meeting's outcomes and the peculiarities of the water rights statute, and a separate question about whether the current ordinance on trail camp distances was enforceable given the condition of the eastern road. It had been an entirely practical conversation about civic infrastructure. It had lasted perhaps 8 minutes. She had thought about it, on and off, for the following 2 weeks. July's meeting she had arrived early because she was curious to see whether the seat would be taken if she came before everyone else. It was not. It was empty, with its armrest slightly different from the others in a way she could not precisely define, as though something had recently rested on it. She sat down. She considered this. She did not reach a conclusion. After the July meeting, he walked her home again. This time the conversation lasted 12 minutes and covered the newspaper's recent editorial, the quality of the new road paving on the main thoroughfare, and briefly the subject of St. Louis, where Esther had mentioned something about the Mississippi. "You miss it?" he asked. "Parts of it," she said. "The bookshop on Chestnut Street, the way the river smells in the evening." She paused. "You?" "I'm from Colorado," he said. "I miss the mountains sometimes, the scale of them." "But you stay," she said. "I stay," he said. They had reached her door by then. He had tipped his hat and gone back up the street, and she had stood on her step for a moment watching the space where he had been, which told her something she chose not to examine directly. August was the peak of the drive season, and the meeting was chaotic in the way only a cattle town in August could be. Loud, overcrowded, and periodically interrupted by sounds from the street outside that suggested someone was conducting an unauthorized horse race. Joel had handled it all with the same unhurried steadiness she had come to associate with him specifically, though she knew it was a quality he had cultivated rather than simply possessed, because steadiness in the face of chaos was not a natural condition. It was a practiced one. It cost something. She wondered what it cost him, specifically, and decided this was not the sort of thing you asked a man after knowing him for less than a year. September's meeting had been notable for two things. First, a proposal to establish a public lending library that Esther had drafted with the help of the schoolteacher, a practical and energetic woman named Florence Dunn, had been presented and largely approved in principle, pending the identification of a suitable space and a source of initial funding. Esther had spoken for almost 10 minutes on this subject and had felt the specific pleasure of being both prepared and persuasive. Second, and more privately notable, was what had happened afterward. They had walked together again, which was by September not remarkable, since they had done it enough that it was simply something that happened after meetings. But this time the street had been quieter than usual, and the night air had that particular September quality of being cool and clean and carrying the smell of the prairie, and they had not talked about civic matters. They had talked about books. She had asked him what he read, expecting to catalog it as one more piece of information, and he had told her about a history of the Roman Republic that he had been working through for a month, and about a poetry collection he had read in his 20s that he still thought about, and about the fact that he had very limited patience for novels that kept secrets from the reader without a good reason. "Withholding things for effect isn't drama," he said. "It's just withholding. What's the difference between withholding things for effect and simply not knowing how to say them?" she asked, and the words had come out slightly more pointed than she intended, aimed at something she had not planned to aim at. He had looked at her in the dark street for a moment. "I suppose the difference is honesty about the difficulty," he said. She had thought about that sentence for 3 weeks. October. The meeting was the anniversary of her arrival in Caldwell, though she did not mention this to anyone because it seemed like a private accounting. She had been here a year. The store was profitable. She had friends now, or the beginning of what would become friendships. Florence Dunn and her dry humor, Ruth Keller's mother Margaret, who brought preserves to the store twice a year, and sat and talked for an hour, Mavis Holloway, who knew everything about everyone and said so plainly and without cruelty. She had a cat who had moved in without being invited, which she had named Register because he sat on the account books. She walked into the town hall for the October meeting and found her seat empty with the red ribbon tied to the armrest. And Mavis Holloway, who had apparently decided that November was close enough to the anniversary of this situation, and that enough was enough, leaned over and told her what she had been looking at for 12 months. She stood there in the middle of the hall while the room filled around her, and the lamps were lit, and people found their seats, and she stared at Joel Ashford's back, and she felt the enormous and disorienting sensation of something shifting permanently into a new configuration. He had been doing this since November of the previous year, since the very first meeting she had attended. Since which meant he had either noticed her before the first meeting or he had noticed her at the first meeting and done something about it before the second one, which was December. And whichever of those was true, it meant that for a full year he had made a small, quiet, private gesture that said, "This seat is for her." Not announced, not explained. Just done month after month in the 2 hours before everyone else arrived, with a piece of red ribbon tied to a chair. She could not decide if she was furious or devastated or something so far beyond both of those things that she did not have a word for it. She sat down in the chair. The ribbon was soft under her fingers. She waited. The meeting started. She did not hear most of it. Afterward, when people were filing out, she did not collect her things and wait for him to walk beside her the way they had been doing for 4 months. She walked out quickly, her coat half-buttoned, and got a block away before she heard footsteps behind her. "Esther," she stopped. She did not turn around immediately. She took one breath, then two, and then she turned. Joel Ashford stood 10 feet away in the dark street with his hat in his hand, and his expression was the expression of a man who has been expecting a conversation and is not entirely sure he is ready for it. "You know," she said. It was not a question. "Mavis told you," he said, which was also not a question. "Mavis told me," she confirmed. "A year, Joel." He said nothing for a moment. The October wind moved through the street between them, carrying the smell of wood smoke and the distant sound of the cattle yards. "I know," he said. "You have been coming to that hall 2 hours before every meeting for a year," she said, "and tying a ribbon to a chair and then not saying a word about it to me." "Yes," he said. That is, she started and stopped, because she was not yet sure whether the sentence ended with "the strangest thing anyone has ever done," or "the most considerate thing I have ever heard," or something else entirely, and she did not want to commit to a direction until she knew which it was. "I know how it sounds," he said. "Do you?" "Peculiar," he said. "Possibly excessive. I've thought about it." "Then why?" she asked, and her voice came out much quieter than she expected, stripped of the sharpness she had been using as scaffolding, and just honestly asking. He looked at her for a long moment. He put his hat back on and took it off again, which was the most visibly uncertain she had ever seen him. "Because you walked into that meeting in November and sat in that chair and you had a notebook," he said, "and you were paying attention to everything, and you looked like you were going to figure this whole town out and make it better by sheer will, and I thought." He stopped. "What did you think?" she asked. "That I wanted you to have a good seat," he said. "That's where it started. It was that simple." He paused, and then it became less simple. The wind moved between them again. "When did it become less simple?" she asked. "December," he said. "When you sat back down in that chair without hesitating, like it was yours, and I realized I'd been hoping you would." Esther looked at him. She had catalogued this man for a year. She had noted his directness and his steadiness and his quality of listening and the way he said things that stayed in her mind for weeks. She had been extremely careful not to call any of this by its correct name. She had been, she now understood, doing her own version of tying a ribbon to a chair and saying nothing about it. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It would have saved me considerable confusion. I know. And a great deal of effort looking for other explanations." "I expect so." She looked at him in the dark street in October in Caldwell, Kansas, and she made a decision the way she made all her important decisions, clearly and without flinching. "I would like to have dinner with you," she said, "not as a civic courtesy, as a declaration of intent." Something moved across his face that she had not seen there before. It was, she thought, relief. "Sunday?" he asked. "Sunday," she said. She walked back to her store feeling like the ground had changed angles under her feet. Not dangerously, but in the way that a road sometimes tilts gently toward a destination you have been trying to reach for longer than you realized. Sunday came with pale gold autumn light, and the smell of dried grass and a sky so blue it looked intentional. Esther spent the morning in the store and told herself 3 times that she was not nervous, which was a lie, but a useful one. She wore her dark green dress, which was not her finest but was the one she felt most like herself in, with her hair pinned up except for 2 pieces that escaped at her temples, and that she had stopped fighting somewhere around June. Joel came to the store at noon, and they walked together to the hotel dining room, which was the nicest restaurant Caldwell could offer, operated by a French-Canadian man named Louis Trepanier, who had arrived on the trail 12 years before, and had apparently decided that the frontier did not have to mean bad cooking. The dining room had tablecloths and candles, and Louis himself, who had opinions about everything, and expressed them with equal warmth to everyone. They sat across from each other, and it was different from walking beside each other in the dark after meetings, because now there was a table between them and direct eye contact, and the full clarity of afternoon light coming through the windows, and for approximately 3 minutes there was a charged and slightly awkward silence that Esther broke by asking him directly whether he was nervous. "Considerably," he said. "Good," she said. "So am I. Now we can stop pretending otherwise." His smile at that was genuine and unguarded, and she had not seen it quite like that before, without any of the careful public steadiness he maintained by habit. It made him look younger and somewhat like a person who had not been expecting to be happy today and was surprised to find he was. They talked for 3 hours. Louis brought food and cleared plates and brought more coffee and pretended not to be delighted by the proceedings, though his delight was evident to everyone in the restaurant who happened to be watching, which was most of them. They talked about real things, not the civic infrastructure and statute discussions that had been their territory for the past year, though those things were not foreign to them. They talked about what they wanted and what they feared, and what had brought them to this specific place in the world. She told him about St. Louis, about her father who had died when she was 14 and her mother who had remarried a man Esther found tolerable and had moved to Ohio, about the bookshop job she had held for 3 years before her uncle's letter arrived. She told him about the loneliness of the early months in Caldwell, about the terror of looking at the account books the week after her uncle's funeral, and realizing the depth of the hole she was in, about the cat who sat on the accounts. He told her about Colorado, about his father's sheep ranch outside Durango, and the particular quality of winter silence in the mountains. He told her about Dodge City, which he described as educational in the way that very difficult things are educational, meaning he was glad to have learned what he learned from it and glad to have left. He told her about the 4 years in Caldwell and what it meant to him to build something in a place, to have the kind of work that was tangled up with actual people and their actual lives. He told her carefully about Clara Birch, and she listened without interrupting, and when he was done, she said only that she was sorry it had hurt him, and he said it had been a long time ago now, and he thought mostly it had taught him what he actually wanted, which was worth something. "What do you actually want?" she asked. He looked at her across the tablecloth in Louis Trepanier's dining room in the October afternoon light. "This," he said simply. She looked back at him. "That's a very broad answer. It's the accurate one." She considered him for a moment. Then she said, "I want to tell you something, and I want you to know it's not easy for me to say." "All right." "I have been thinking about you," she said, "since approximately March, in a way that had nothing to do with water rights or town ordinances. I was aware of it, and I was very disciplined about not doing anything about it, partly because I was not sure and partly because I had a significant amount of practical business to attend to, and I was using that as an excuse." He said nothing, but his expression was attentive and warm, and she pressed forward. "Hearing about the chair today was," she paused, searching for the right word, "destabilizing, not in a bad way. In the way that things are destabilizing when you have been very carefully not falling in love with someone, and then you discover evidence that the falling has been happening anyway, regardless of your efforts to prevent it. He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't mean for it to feel like a secret," he said then. "The ribbon. I kept meaning to say something. Every meeting, you were there and you were exactly yourself. And I thought what I was working and I didn't want to change it and make things awkward between us when awkward between us would mean losing the thing I had." "The thing you had being the chair and the walking home afterward," she said. "The chair and the walking home afterward and knowing you'd be at the next meeting," he said. Yes. She understood this. She understood it because she had been doing her own version of the same calculation for months, accepting the proximity and building something out of it quietly, afraid that naming it would break it. "We've both been terrible at this," she observed. He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh like that openly, and it was lovely. "We have been extraordinarily terrible at it," he agreed. They walked home that evening in the kind of easy silence that takes most people years to build between themselves, and she thought that maybe they had been building it for a year without realizing it. All those post-meeting walks and cross-referenced notes and 8-minute conversations that turned into 12-minute ones. At her door, in the blue dark of the October night, he asked if he might call on her properly. She said yes. He said Saturday. She said Saturday. He said goodnight and walked back up the street, and she went inside and sat down in the chair beside the stove, and Register the cat climbed into her lap, and she sat there for a long time not reading anything, just existing in the very pleasant state of being a person who has finally stopped pretending something is not true. Saturday he came and they walked along the edge of town where the prairie started, and the grass was long and pale gold in the autumn afternoon. He brought 2 apples, and she brought a piece of cheese wrapped in cloth, and they sat on the fence rail at the edge of old man Pullman's property and ate and talked. He told her about Consequence, his horse, who he described as having strong opinions about which direction was acceptable for a morning ride, and she told him about her ongoing negotiation with Register regarding the account books, which Register continued to consider personal furniture despite significant evidence to the contrary. The following weeks had a particular quality of expanding possibility. She had not known before that this was a thing that could happen, that the world could simply become larger and more interesting because a specific person was in it and was oriented toward you. She had read about it in novels and had assumed there was significant exaggeration involved. There was less exaggeration involved than she had believed. He came to the store sometimes in the mornings, not every day but enough that Ruth Keller began to arrive with a slightly knowing expression that she did not comment on, which was a quality in Ruth that Esther appreciated enormously. He brought her things. Once a copy of a Harper's Monthly that had a piece on Roman history she thought she'd find interesting. Once a small jar of honey from the Berriman farm, because she'd mentioned in passing that she'd been wanting to make ginger cake. Once, without ceremony, a book of poetry by Emily Dickinson, handed over the counter with the same matter-of-fact directness with which he did everything. "You mentioned Miss Dickinson in August," he said, when she looked up from the book's cover. She had said something about Dickinson in August. She had said it in passing, mid-conversation, about something else entirely. She had not expected him to remember it. She opened the book and looked at the inscription page, and her breath caught in her chest, because he had written in the front, "For E.G., who pays attention to things." She looked up at him across the counter. He was already turning to leave, and she said his name, and he turned back and she said, "This is the nicest thing anyone has given me in recent memory." "You deserve nice things," he said, with the uncomplicated directness of a man who has decided to stop being careful, and then he went back out into the November morning. She put the book under the counter and then took it out again and put it on the shelf behind the register where she could see the spine, and she stood there for a full minute not doing anything, which was not like her at all. November's town meeting was different from every meeting before it. She arrived at her usual time, and the chair in the 3rd row, second from the aisle, had a red ribbon tied to its armrest. She sat in it. She reached down and untied the ribbon gently and put it in her coat pocket. She would keep it. She did not need to examine why she would keep it. She knew why she would keep it. Joel was at the front of the room with the mayor and council, looking at a document. He did not look up when she came in. But when the meeting started and he stood to address the room, he looked in her direction first for just a moment before he looked anywhere else. She wrote in her notebook. She spoke twice. The second time she spoke, she caught him looking at her with an expression that she could now, with October's honesty between them, name correctly. It was the expression of a person watching someone they love do something well. After the meeting, he did not wait to be asked. He simply fell into step beside her on the way out, and they walked together through the November cold, and the conversation was easy and warm, and she had the sensation, walking beside him, of being exactly where she was supposed to be, which was not a thing she had allowed herself to feel often in her life because it had not previously been reliable. At her door he paused. She paused. There was a brief silence that was not uncomfortable. "I'd like to kiss you," he said, with the same directness he had been applying to everything since that Sunday in October, "if that would be agreeable." She looked at him in the lamplight from the store window. "That would be entirely agreeable," she said. He kissed her. It was careful and warm and lasted slightly longer than careful, and when it was done she was still standing on her doorstep and the November night was cold and the stars over Caldwell, Kansas, were brilliant and numerous, and she thought, "There it is. There is the thing I have been not naming for the better part of a year." "Good night, Esther," he said. "Good night, Joel," she said. She went inside and stood in the middle of her store in her coat for a full minute before Register's demanding sound from the direction of the stove reminded her that she had practical responsibilities. December brought cold, and a shorter meeting than usual, conducted with the cheerful efficiency of people who wanted to be done and back near their fires. It also brought the first real complications. Cord Vance, the land scheme man whom Joel had arrested 3 years before, had been released from the territorial prison in Leavenworth after serving his sentence. This was not surprising. The sentence had always had an end date, but the fact of his release put a certain quality of alertness into Joel that Esther noticed without being able to name it for the first 2 weeks of December. She noticed it because she paid attention to him now in all the ways she had been paying attention quietly from a distance for the past year. And so the change in the set of his shoulders and the increased attention he paid to the street when he was walking were visible to her in a way they might not have been to someone who had not been studying him for a year and a half. She asked him about it directly on a Wednesday evening when he had come to help her carry a delivery of heavy stock from the back of a wagon into the store, a task he had offered for without being asked and that she had accepted because the crates were genuinely very heavy. "Cord Vance," she said, when the last crate was inside and they were standing in the lamplight of the back storeroom. He looked at her. "Mavis," he said. "No, actually. You," she said. "You've been scanning the street differently for 2 weeks. What are you looking for?" He was quiet for a moment, his expression evaluating. "Vance is out," he said. "Promised to settle a debt with me when he was." "I take promises like that seriously." "What kind of settling?" she asked. He said it clearly because he had decided to stop being careful with her. "He meant harm to my reputation or my person. I don't know which yet." She absorbed this. "Then you need to know which," she said. "I'm working on it. What can I do?" He looked at her with an expression that contained something she identified as both gratitude and discomfort, the particular discomfort of a person who is used to managing dangers alone and is encountering the fact that there is someone whose inclusion in the management of those dangers is both desirable and frightening to him. "Stay alert," he said. "Tell me if anything feels wrong in the store or if anyone asks you questions about me that feel like they're gathering information." "All right," she said. "And Esther," he said, "this doesn't change things. I just want you to know what's happening." "Good," she said, "because I would be considerably angrier if you kept it from me than I would be at the risk itself." "I know," he said. "That's why I told you." She thought, This is what it means to trust someone. Not the absence of secrets, because everyone has a past and a private self, but the choice to say the difficult thing rather than protect the other person from information they have the right to have. January was cold and tense, and Cord Vance had apparently settled in Wichita, 40 miles away, which was close enough to be concerning but far enough to be unactionable. Joel's deputies, young men named Carter and Webb who were capable and loyal, had made quiet inquiries and reported back that Vance was keeping himself visible and legitimate, which meant either that he had abandoned the threat or that he was waiting for something. Neither conclusion was comfortable. Esther kept her eyes open and her observations to herself, except when she had something specific and useful to report. She reported in January that a man she didn't recognize had been in the store asking about Joel's work schedule, specifically about which evenings he was usually at the office late. She described the man. Joel went very still and then said the description matched someone who had worked for Vance 3 years ago. He thanked her. He sent Carter to watch the road south of town. The man did not come back to the store. Carter found evidence of a brief camp a mile out of town that had been abandoned recently. Someone had been watching and had left. Whether this was because they had what they came for, or because they had lost their nerve, or because they had decided a different approach was needed remained unclear. Esther did not sleep particularly well in January. She did, however, spend a great deal of time with Joel, which helped with the not sleeping. He came to the store most evenings now, not on any official pretext, but simply because they had established a habit of each other that had stopped requiring justification. They cooked sometimes in the small kitchen at the back of her store quarters, working around each other with the easy coordination of people who have figured out each other's spatial habits, and they ate at the small table and talked about whatever presented itself. She told him, one January evening over a pot of coffee, that she had decided she was going to stay in Caldwell permanently. Not as a provisional arrangement, not as a thing she was doing until something better came along, but as a genuine choice, which was different from the accidental staying she had done in the first year. He was quiet for a moment. Because of the store, he asked. Partly the store, she said. Partly Florence and her lending library project, which is going to need someone persistent on its side. Partly the sky, which I have come to have a genuine affection for despite it offering no shelter whatsoever. She looked at him across the table. Partly you. He put his coffee cup down. Esther, he said, in the tone of a man who is about to say something he has been thinking about for a while. Yes, she said. I want to ask you something, he said. But I want to be clear that the answer is not going to change anything about what we have if you're not ready. I'm not going anywhere and neither is the store and there's no urgency except that I've been thinking about it and I don't want to be the kind of person who thinks about something important for 6 months and doesn't say it. She looked at him. Her heart was doing something very loud behind her ribs. Then say it, she said. Will you marry me, he said. Not immediately if you don't want immediately, but eventually if that's something you want, because it's something I want. Considerably. She considered him for a moment. The man with the amber-brown eyes and the hat he couldn't stop picking up and putting down when he was uncertain, and the handwriting that was unexpectedly neat for someone with large hands, who had tied a ribbon to a chair for a year and given her a book of Dickinson, and answered her questions about lamp oil statutes with actual respect and said, without any fanfare, that he wanted this. Yes, she said. He blinked. Yes, not immediately, she added, because there are practical arrangements to make and also because I want to enjoy this part for a while before it becomes the next part. But yes, eventually. Yes, certainly. The smile that crossed his face was the same one she had seen at Louis Trepanier's dining room in October, the unguarded one that made him look surprised by happiness. She thought she would like to see that smile as many times as possible for the foreseeable future. All right, he said, and the relief in his voice made her love him actively and specifically in a way that was different from all the months of careful accumulation before. This was not observation. This was certainty. February came, and with it the resolution of the Vance problem, which resolved itself not through violence, but through the particular kind of reckoning that happens when a man who believes himself owed a debt discovers that the accounting has changed. Cord Vance rode into Caldwell on a cold, gray morning in the second week of February. He did not come armed for trouble. He came, as it turned out, with a lawyer. He had been, apparently, reconsidering his options in the weeks since his man had scouted the town and found it better watched than anticipated. He had decided, with whatever combination of practicality and residual conscience was available to him, that a legal challenge to certain aspects of his conviction was preferable to the kind of settling he had originally intended. He and Joel faced each other in the main street, which was the moment the town had been quietly dreading, and the conversation was brief and contained and conducted with the particular formality of two men who thoroughly dislike each other and are both choosing, for different reasons, to behave. "I want the property assessment reconsidered," Vance said. "That's a matter for the territorial court," Joel said. "Then I'll take it to the territorial court." "That's your right," Joel said. Vance looked at him for a long moment with an expression that had in it everything he had promised and was choosing not to deliver. Then he nodded once, got back on his horse, and rode out of Caldwell. Carter and Webb watched him go until he was a small shape on the flat road east. Esther, who had watched from the window of the store, let out a breath she had been holding for 6 weeks. Joel came to the store that afternoon and she said, "Is it finished?" And he said, "I think so. At least the dangerous part," and she came around the counter and took his face in her hands and kissed him, which surprised him enough that it took him a full second to respond, and then he responded thoroughly. "Well," he said when she let him go. "I have been wanting to do that for 6 weeks," she said. "Feel free to do it whenever the situation warrants," he said. "I'll exercise my judgment on that," she said, and went back behind the counter. And he stood there for a moment with the expression of a man who is quite happy and is aware of being quite happy, which she catalogued as one of her favorite things. Spring arrived slowly and then all at once, the way Kansas springs do, with a week of mud and then a week of everything turning green so fast you could almost watch it happening. Esther and Joel had established, over the winter, a relationship that was known to everyone in Caldwell without needing to be formally announced. They were simply a fact, the way the creek north of town was a fact, something that had always been there if you knew where to look. The practical business of planning a future together was a thing they worked on incrementally, with the same approach they both naturally applied to problems, systematically and without excessive drama. The questions of the store and the house and the practical logistics of combining two lives that had been separate were addressed one at a time, in conversations over coffee, or in the evenings when they cooked together, or on their walks at the edge of the prairie where the grass was coming back green and the sky was enormous and blue. He had a small house. She had the store's back rooms. The store's back rooms, extended and properly finished, were actually more practical for both of them since he could walk to the sheriff's office in 5 minutes, and the store was self-evidently already there. They discussed this and agreed on it and began having conversations with a builder about what the work would require, which turned out to be rather more than either of them had anticipated, but not impossible. April's town meeting was the occasion on which Florence Dunn's lending library proposal came up for a full vote following months of practical organization that had largely been managed by Florence and Esther together. They had identified a space, a room above the newspaper office whose owner was willing to donate its use. They had identified initial funding from a combination of town budget and 4 prominent local donors. They had assembled an initial collection of 230 books from donations, purchases, and one very significant contribution from Joel's personal shelves that he had delivered to the newspaper office in 2 large crates without mentioning it to anyone, until Florence found the donation note inside and told Esther. The proposal passed. Florence cried, briefly and with dignity. Esther did not cry because she had been planning for this outcome and had not allowed herself to consider the alternative. But she felt something large and warm in her chest that she recognized as the specific joy of making a real thing out of an idea. Afterward, at the door of the hall, Joel found her and said, "The books from my shelves. I know about the books," she said. "Florence wasn't supposed to. Florence was entirely supposed to," she said. "You knew she would. You left a note." He looked at her with an expression that was almost sheepish. "I didn't want you to think I was doing it for the recognition," he said. "I think you were doing it because you believe in the library and because you have 2 crates of books you've already read," she said. "Both of which are good reasons. You're very precise about motivations," he said. "I am," she said. "Yours are usually uncomplicated, which is refreshing." They were married in May, which was a practical choice because May in Kansas was glorious and the church had good light, and most of the farming families could get to town more easily in the dry season before the summer drives began. Florence organized the flowers. Ruth Keller and her mother Margaret organized the food for the reception, which was held in the church hall and featured a quantity of fried chicken and cornbread, and 3 different kinds of pie that represented the contributions of approximately 15 different families in and around Caldwell. Louis Trepanier made a cake that he spent 3 days on and presented with such ceremony that there was a general round of applause. The ceremony was at 2 in the afternoon, and the light through the church windows was the particular gold of Kansas in May, and Esther wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she had ordered from St. Louis. A deep navy blue that was practical enough not to be absurd, but fine enough to be a proper wedding dress. And she walked into the church on Florence's arm, because Florence had asked with such pointed directness whether Esther wanted someone beside her, and the answer had been yes without qualification. Joel stood at the front of the church in his good coat with his badge on. There had been some discussion about the badge, and the consensus had been that the badge was part of who he was in Caldwell, and it would be strange to take it off for the occasion, and his expression when he saw her was the unguarded, surprised by happiness one, and she thought, "There it is again," and walked toward him. The vows were said with the same directness that characterized everything they did together. The minister, a gentle man named Reverend Cross who had known Joel for 4 years, looked between them with an expression of someone performing a ceremony that seems inevitable rather than novel, which Esther supposed it was. They were married. It was straightforward and certain and real. The summer was full and busy and good. The store prospered. The drives came and went with the usual combination of commerce and commotion, and Joel managed both with his customary steadiness, which Esther observed from the store window on the days when the main street was full of dusty, cheerful cowhands spending their wages on necessaries and non-necessaries. She had learned the rhythm of drive season now and knew how to manage her stock and her customers and the particular energy of a cattle town in full summer operation. They had established themselves in the expanded back rooms of the store, which the builder had finished in May just in time to be genuinely useful. Joel's things had arrived from his house in stages, and the process of combining 2 people's accumulated objects was illuminating in the way that all intimate domestic tasks are illuminating. You learn things about a person through their possessions that you might not learn any other way. She learned that he had kept every letter he had received since his 20s, bundled by year, in a tin box. She learned that he had 3 different sharpening stones of increasing fineness for his knives, which he maintained with a precision that she found endearing and characteristic. She learned that he had, tucked under the bed frame, a very old and well-worn quilt that he had had since Colorado, which she was not to wash because the particular softness of it was a function of accumulated years and water would ruin it. She did not wash the quilt. She did, however, add it to the bed, where it lived alongside her own quilts in a comfortable domesticity that felt like the outward form of everything she had been building toward. He learned about her too. He learned that she kept her books in a specific order that was neither alphabetical nor by size, but by some internal system of emotional association that she could not explain in terms that fully satisfied him, but that she nonetheless navigated perfectly every time. He learned that she did not eat breakfast immediately upon waking, but required at least 40 minutes of consciousness before food seemed appealing, a preference he accommodated by making coffee and leaving it on the stove and not mentioning food until she initiated the topic. He learned that she cried at precisely one category of situation, not sad things, not frightening things, but specifically at evidence of unexpected kindness between strangers, which she found overwhelmingly moving for reasons that had something to do with her father and his death when she was 14, and the way the neighbors had come, without being asked, to help her mother with the practical things. By the fall, Esther Grady, she had not changed her name professionally, which was a topic they had discussed and resolved with characteristic practicality, since the store was called Grady's, and changing it would confuse the suppliers was pregnant. She had suspected it since August and confirmed it quietly with Dr. Lennox in September, and told Joel on a Sunday evening when they were sitting on the store's back step, watching the stars come out over the prairie. She said it simply, the way she said most things. He was quiet for long enough that she turned to look at him, and his expression was something she had not quite seen before. The uncomplicated, surprised happiness, yes, but layered under it something that looked very much like reverence. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you all right?" "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I feel, in fact, notably well, which Dr. Lennox says is a good sign." He took her hand, which he held with a care that was almost comical, as though it were suddenly more fragile than it had been an hour before. "Joel," she said, "my hand is the same as it was." "I know," he said. Just give me a moment." She gave him a moment. "A baby," he said after the moment. "A baby," she confirmed. He looked out at the prairie and the coming dark and the first stars of the September evening, and she watched his face and thought that whatever she had accumulated in the past 2 years, the store, the friends, the library, the marriage, the life she had built out of accident and will and one cold October morning and one piece of red ribbon, all of it had been leading to sitting on this step and watching this particular man encounter this particular news and seeing in his face that he was unambiguously and completely glad. "All right," he said at last. "All right," she repeated. "I mean yes," he said. "I mean thank you. I mean I'm not sure I have the right word." "You don't need one," she said. He turned and kissed her temple and kept her hand, and they sat there until the stars were fully out and the night was cool, and the sound of Caldwell going about its evening business reached them faintly from the main street. The November meeting that year was the last one before the baby came, and Esther attended it with a practicality she maintained in the face of everyone else's collective desire to make a fuss. She sat in the third row, second from the aisle, in the chair that did not have a ribbon on it anymore because she had told Joel in September that he did not need to do that anymore. "You could just sit with me," she had said. He had looked at her. "Is that allowed?" he asked, meaning not the logistics of seating but the change in their public arrangement, the visible declaration of togetherness at an official civic function where he was in his official capacity. "I think it's more than allowed at this point," she said. "I'll put the ribbon in the drawer," he said. "Keep it," she said. "I still have my piece." He had kept his ribbon in the drawer, and she still had her piece in the small box on her dressing table, where she kept the things that mattered. And in November, he sat beside her in the third row, instead of at the front with the council, sending a signal that everyone in the hall received clearly, and that produced the particular quality of collective warmth that a community feels when a thing it has been quietly rooting for has finally come together properly. Their son was born in January of 1885, delivered by Dr. Lennox on a cold, clear morning when the snow lay 2 inches deep on the Caldwell streets, and the light through the bedroom window was sharp and white and winter bright. He came into the world with considerable opinion about the process, expressed at significant volume, and settled quickly into a sturdy calm that Esther recognized as characteristic. They named him William, after Joel's father, and Gerald, after Esther's uncle who had inadvertently started everything by writing a letter about dry goods and a growing town. William Gerald Ashford was a serious and observant baby who watched the world from very early on with an attention that Esther, looking at him, recognized as a quality she had seen before. He watched things. He paid attention. He would, she suspected, be the kind of person who noticed everything and filed it away, and this made her feel something that was not quite pride but was adjacent to it, the particular feeling of recognizing yourself in a new person. Joel held his son in the January morning with the same expression he had worn when she told him on the back step in September, the one with the reverence in it. "Hello, William," he said, in the same level and direct tone he used for everything, and William blinked at him with the blurry, focused attention of a very new person encountering a very specific face, and Esther watched this from the bed and thought, there it is again, the unguarded happiness. The surprised by this life expression, she would never stop being glad she had stayed in Caldwell. The months that followed had the quality of a life in full operation. William grew and changed at the speed that babies do, which is simultaneously faster and slower than you expect. And Esther ran the store and organized the library's second year, and attended the town meetings and spoke at the town meetings. And Joel managed the sheriff's office and came home every evening, and they ate together and talked and were, in the specific and unspectacular way that constitutes real happiness, content. Ruth Keller was now full-time at the store and had become, over the 3 years of her employment, not only indispensable but genuinely impressive, with a head for accounts and a quality of organizational thinking that Esther recognized and actively encouraged. She had, in a small way, become a kind of mentor to Ruth, and she found this satisfying in a way that surprised her, the sense of passing something useful forward. The library opened its proper rooms in February of 1885, with proper shelves and a card catalog system that Esther had designed and Florence had implemented, and that the library's 12 regular borrowers immediately began testing to its full capacity. The dedication was a small event with most of the town present, and Florence gave a short speech and Esther spoke briefly, and Joel stood in the back of the room and applauded, and William, who had come to his first public event, slept through all of it in his father's arms, which was the correct decision. By the second half of 1885, the Vance matter had been fully resolved. The territorial court had examined the original conviction and found it sound. Cord Vance had exhausted his appeals and, apparently, exhausted his desire for further complication. He moved away from Kansas. Reports had him going west, toward California, which was far enough to be satisfying. The last of the tension Esther had been carrying in her shoulders since December of 1883 finally and completely released, and she had not fully realized how present it had been until she felt its absence. Joel noticed. "You're less watchful," he said one evening. "Vance," she said. "Yes," he said. "Is it obvious that it was affecting me?" "Only to me," he said, "and only because I know what you look like when you're carrying something." She thought about this. She thought about what it meant to be known by someone, specifically and accurately over time. "You know what I look like when I'm carrying something," she said. "I've been paying attention for 3 years," he said. "Only 3. She said, 2.5 technically, he said. "From November 1882 to now. 2.5 years of paying attention," she said. "Before and after." "Before and after," he agreed. She looked at him across the supper table in the lamplight of their kitchen in the expanded back rooms of Grady's dry goods store in Caldwell, Kansas, with William asleep in the cradle beside the stove, and Register the cat asleep on the account books, as he had been doing for 3 years regardless of her feelings about it. And she thought, "I came here with $43 and a box of sewing supplies and a quantity of determination that was apparently sufficient to the purpose. I did not plan any of this. I built it anyway. I love you," she said, because she did, specifically and certainly and daily, and she had gotten out of the habit of not saying the true thing when she knew what it was. "I love you," he said, which he said with the same uncomplicated directness he had applied to everything since October 1883 when she had asked him to stop being careful. Considerably. The November meeting of 1885 was where Esther gave her longest speech yet. A 12-minute presentation on a proposed expansion of the school building that she had been advocating for since summer, supported by data about the growing student enrollment, and a cost analysis she had prepared with the help of the town lawyer. The proposal passed, 3-2, with the deciding vote belonging to the mayor, a pragmatic man named Abbott who Esther had been providing with carefully organized information about this issue for 4 months. She sat back down in the third row, second from the aisle, beside Joel, who had been watching her present from the chair to her left rather than from the front of the room with the council. He did not say anything when she sat down, but he put his hand over hers on the armrest briefly, quickly, in a way that was visible to Mavis Holloway in the row behind them, and to approximately 8 other people, all of whom later reported the gesture to various other people, because Caldwell was a small town, and that was how small towns worked. The year turned to 1886, and Esther discovered in February that William was going to have a sibling, which she announced to Joel in the same matter-of-fact way she had announced William, because by now this was their established pattern and it worked. This time Joel's reaction was faster. He did not need a moment. "Good," he said immediately, and she laughed. "That's all," she said. "I'm getting better at this," he said. He was smiling. "When?" "Late summer," she said. "Dr. Lennox says late August." The baby came in August, as promised, on a hot prairie evening when the air smelled of dry grass and the sun was setting orange and long over the flat western horizon. This was a girl, which Dr. Lennox announced with the same calm practicality with which he announced all things. They named her Clara, not after Joel's old schoolteacher. That would have been strange, but after Esther's grandmother, who had been a practical and clear-eyed woman that Esther had loved, and whose name seemed to fit. Clara Ashford arrived in the world considerably more peacefully than her brother had, and regarded her surroundings with a wide-eyed and curious attention that was immediately apparent even in the first days. William, who was 18 months old and had developed strong opinions about most things, examined his sister with the focused attention he had inherited from both parents, and arrived at a positive verdict expressed in the limited but emphatic vocabulary of a toddler, which amounted to approval. The store continued to grow. Ruth Keller, now 19 and managing more of the day-to-day operations than ever, had become someone Esther thought of not just as an employee, but as a person she was genuinely invested in. She had begun, quietly, to have conversations with Ruth about the future of the store in a way that planted seeds she intended to tend carefully over the coming years. Ruth had a brother who was farming and a mother who was hoping for a grandchild, and a head for numbers that deserved a proper future. The library grew too. Florence Dunn had expanded it to 400 volumes and had begun a reading program for the town's children on Saturday mornings that quickly became one of the most popular events in Caldwell's social calendar, which said something both about the library and about the limited competition for Saturday morning entertainment in a prairie cattle town. Joel had been re-elected sheriff in the fall of 1885 by an overwhelming margin, which had surprised no one except Joel himself, who approached the prospect of election with a faint suspicion that still startled Esther a little, given how universally regarded he was. She had told him once that he was the last person in Caldwell to understand how well-liked he was, and he had looked at her with an expression of genuine uncertainty about whether this was true, which only proved her point. He was good at the work. He was good at it because he cared about it as a thing that mattered, not as a thing that reflected well on him, and that distinction was visible in everything he did. In the way he handled disputes, in the way he maintained relationships with the farming families outside town, who did not have the same immediate access to law as those in the center, in the way he made sure his deputies were trained rather than simply employed. Carter had gotten married in the spring of 1886 to a woman from Wellington, a quiet and funny redhead named Agnes who fit into Caldwell's social fabric with the ease of someone who had been waiting for exactly this town. Webb had taken a deputy position in Wichita, which was a promotion and a loss, and Joel had hired a new deputy named Thomas Hare, a young man from a farming family outside town who had, in Joel's assessment, good judgment and a teachable disposition. Thomas Hare was 23, which was not old but old enough, and he had the quality of paying attention to things that Joel apparently looked for in people he was responsible for training. Esther met him in the first week of his employment when he came into the store for supplies and assessed him in approximately 4 minutes as reliable, earnest, slightly intimidated by the sheriff's wife, and fundamentally well-intentioned. "He'll be fine," she told Joel that evening. "I think so too," Joel said. "He's afraid of me," she said. "Most people are afraid of you for the first 6 months," Joel said in the tone of someone reporting a fact. "It passes." "I'm not intimidating," she said. He looked at her with a specific expression. "You notice everything and you say exactly what you think," he said. "That is, in fact, somewhat intimidating. Coming from the man who asks for a kiss with the formality of a legal proceeding," she said. He laughed. She loved him. The year 1887 arrived, and with it the maturation of many things that had been in progress. The school expansion was complete. The library had become a permanent civic institution rather than a provisional project, with a small annual budget and Florence done as its official librarian, a title she wore with characteristic efficiency. Grady's dry goods store was the most organized commercial establishment in Caldwell, and possibly in all of Sumner County. William was 2 years old and had a vocabulary that the children's book Florence had given him for Christmas seemed to have dramatically accelerated. Clara was approaching 1 and had developed a personality that was sunny and persistent in equal measure, and that she used to extract maximum participation from everyone in her vicinity. One evening in the spring of 1887, Joel came home from the office carrying something wrapped in brown paper, which he set on the kitchen table and said nothing about for approximately 10 minutes, which was unusual. "What is that?" Esther said, because she had the patience of someone who had learned patience specifically, which meant she had some but not unlimited. "A letter," he said, "and something that came with it." "From Colorado," he said. "My brother James." She looked at him. Joel rarely spoke of his family in Colorado, not because of estrangement, but because the distance was large and the mail was slow and the relationship was maintained in the gaps between lives. She knew he had a brother named James who ran the family sheep ranch after their father died, and that he thought about home in the way people think about places they have left, not with regret, exactly, but with a quality of remembered belonging. He opened the package. Inside the letter there was another letter, older, in their father's handwriting, which James had found in a box of papers and had thought Joel should have. It was a letter their father had written years before and apparently never sent, addressed to Joel, about the specific pride their father had in the direction Joel had taken his life. She watched him read it. She said nothing because this was a thing that required silence and the particular kind of presence that is not interference. When he finished, he put the letter down and sat with it for a while. Then he said, "I think I should go to Colorado, take the family, meet James properly, not just through letters." She looked at him. "This summer," she said. "If Ruth can manage the store," he said. "Ruth can manage the store," she said immediately, because Ruth absolutely could. And Florence would keep an eye on the library. Florence would be offended if anyone implied the library required keeping an eye on, Esther said. He smiled. "Then this summer," he said. "Then this summer," she agreed. They went in July, which was the 1 month of the year the drives were slow enough to allow Joel's absence without significant disruption to the sheriff's office. Thomas Hare managed in his stead, with the support of Carter, and did not have any major crises, which Esther considered a good omen. Colorado was extraordinary. She had not known before what it meant when Joel said he missed the scale of the mountains. She had been imagining larger versions of the gentle hills of Missouri, which was not anywhere close to accurate. The mountains were genuinely staggering, enormous and indifferent and beautiful in a way that made the flat Kansas sky she had come to love feel like a different kind of language, neither better nor worse, but entirely different. James Ashford was a big man with Joel's jaw and different eyes, light blue where Joel's were amber, and he received his brother's family on the porch of the ranch house with the slightly formal warmth of a person who is glad but unsure how to show it efficiently. His wife, a woman named Margaret, had absolutely no uncertainty about how to show warmth, and remedied her husband's formality completely within the first 10 minutes by picking up Clara and declaring her magnificent, and getting William to show her his vocabulary, which he did for approximately 20 minutes without stopping. Joel and James spent 3 days doing things that were, Esther suspected, primarily a way of being in the same physical space for the first time in years. They worked on the fence together, and they rode out to look at the sheep, and they sat on the porch in the evenings, and talked in the low-voiced way of brothers who have a history that is larger than any single conversation. Esther watched this, and felt glad for him in a way that was specific and quiet, and that she understood was one of the things love actually consisted of, being glad for the other person's gladness in a way that is separate from your own comfort. They went home in August, back to the flat wide sky and the store and the library and the sheriff's office and the town meeting in the third row, second from the aisle, which had been empty while they were away, and which she sat back down in with a feeling that was recognizably the feeling of returning to where you belong. November of 1887. The meeting was about a new town charter, a matter of some complexity that had been under discussion since spring and that Esther had been preparing for with the same systematic attention she gave to things that mattered. She spoke for 15 minutes and cited 6 specific clauses and suggested 2 modifications that were, she believed, improvements both legally and practically. The modifications were adopted. The mayor thanked her. Delbert Marsh, who had been wrong about water rights in 1883 and had not forgotten it, said nothing. Walking home after the meeting, Joel said, "You've been preparing for that one since June." "April, actually," she said. He shook his head, but with the expression she had learned to identify as fond exasperation. "April," he said. "Some things need to be done correctly," she said. "Some things," he agreed. Clara was 18 months old in November, and had added walking to her list of accomplishments, which she practiced with considerable enthusiasm, and a disregard for obstacles that kept everyone in her vicinity in a constant state of benevolent attention. William, now almost 3, had appointed himself his sister's unofficial supervisor, a role he performed with the earnest seriousness of someone who has been given a job he intends to do well. Esther watched her children in the evenings and felt the specific fullness of a life that has been built deliberately, one decision and 1 year, and one piece of red ribbon at a time. She thought sometimes about the woman who had stepped off the train at Caldwell Station in October of 1882 with $43 and a box of sewing supplies. That woman had been capable and determined, but had been working largely alone. And the aloneness had been functional but not what she wanted, not what she had been too practical to name. She had not known then that 3 weeks later a man would stop in the street and offer 30 words of uncomplicated kindness and a name. She had not known that he would go to a town hall 2 hours before a meeting and tie a piece of ribbon to a chair. She had not known that she would sit in that chair 12 times and not think to ask why it was always empty. She had not known that the whole town had been watching and saying nothing and waiting. She was glad for all of it. The not knowing, the gradual accumulating, the year of proximity before either of them said the true thing. She was glad for Mavis Holloway's particular combination of hawk sharpness and excellent timing. She was glad for October evenings and November stars, and a book of Dickinson handed over a counter with the inscription for E.G., who pays attention to things. She was glad for every cross-referenced note and every post-meeting walk, and every morning she had walked into the town hall and sat in that chair and felt, without knowing why, like she was where she was supposed to be. 1888 arrived and the world kept moving in the way that worlds do. The cattle drives, the store, the library, the meetings, the children growing. Esther and Joel had added to their family in the natural accumulation of years and love and the decision, made jointly in the autumn of 1887, that they were not done yet. Their third child, another boy they named Henry after no one in particular, but because it was a name that seemed to fit, was born in the spring of 1888 with the same January morning vigor that William had displayed 3 years before, and that Esther had come to think of as characteristic of Ashford children. Henry was brown-eyed like his father, and had, even in his first weeks, the quality of watching things carefully that had apparently become a family trait. William at 4 was starting school with Florence Dunn, who had expanded her role at the library to include a connection with the school's reading curriculum. Clara at 2.5 was articulate and opinionated and carried herself with a confidence that Joel noted quietly bore a strong resemblance to the way her mother had walked into the first town meeting. "I walked in late and flustered," Esther pointed out. "You walked in late and flustered and immediately found the best seat in the room," he said. She considered this. "All right," she said. "That's fair." By 1889, Caldwell had grown and the world around it had grown with it. Kansas had been a state since 1861, and the territory to the south was moving toward statehood too, and the cattle drive era was changing shape as the railroads reached further, and the frontier moved west, and the particular wildness of the Kishom Trail days gave way to something more settled and systematic. Esther had watched this change over 7 years in Caldwell with the attention she paid to all things, noting it without mourning it, understanding it as the nature of time. Joel had been re-elected again in 1887 by a margin that was, this time, not close. He was now a fixture of Caldwell in the way that certain people become fixtures of the places they have committed to, not because they are static, but because they are so genuinely part of the place that removing them would require removing part of what the place is. He was on good terms with the new county commissioner. He had trained Thomas Hare well enough that Thomas had begun to be spoken of as a potential sheriff candidate in the next election, which Joel considered a personal success rather than a threat. Esther, 7 years from the train station and 6 years from the ribbon and 5 years from the night she had kissed him in the store after Cord Vance rode out of town, ran the best dry goods store in Sumner County, and sat on the library board and had a standing place on the town meeting agenda and was known, universally, as a person who noticed things and said what she thought and was usually right. She was also, she had understood gradually, and with something that felt like wonder, happy. Specifically, deeply, and in the way that is not dependent on things being perfect, but rather on things being true. The life she had was true. The man she had built it with was true. The children were true and loud and growing and entirely themselves. Ruth Keller, 23 now and managing a full third of the store's operations, had found herself walking out with Thomas Hare since the summer, which Esther had noted in April, and not said anything about because she had learned from her own experience that some things needed to be not said anything about for their proper time. In November of 1889, Esther stood up at the town meeting, in a hall that was full and warm against the November cold outside, and spoke about the proposal for a new water system that would improve the town's fire safety and general sanitation. She spoke for 18 minutes and used maps and a cost projection she had prepared over 3 months, and answered every question that was asked of her with the same focused and specific attention she had been bringing to this room for 7 years. The proposal passed unanimously. She sat back down. Joel, beside her in the third row, second from the aisle, put his hand over hers in the way he had been doing for years, briefly and completely, in the language of people who have been paying attention to each other long enough that the gestures have accumulated their own specific weight. She turned and looked at him. He was watching her with the unguarded expression, the surprised by happiness one, which after all these years and all these meetings and all these evenings and all these children still appeared on his face with the regularity of a man who has never quite gotten used to how good his life is and considers this not a failing but a feature. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. "You're very good at this." "I've had 7 years of practice," she said. "You were good at the first one," he said. "I remember. You had a notebook." She laughed quietly in the middle of the filling out town hall of Caldwell, Kansas in November of 1889, while around them the people of their town gathered their coats and their conversations and made their ways home through the cold. She had come here with $43 and a determination that had been called alarming. She had stayed because she had to, and then because she wanted to, and then because there was no version of her life she could imagine now that did not include this place, this hall, this man beside her, this red ribbon in the small box on her dressing table at home, next to the Dickinson book and William's first tooth, and a small river stone that Henry had pressed into her hand with great ceremony last spring, and that she had understood was a gift of the highest order. Nobody had warned her. Nobody had told her about the chair, about the ribbon, about the year of quiet and faithful attentiveness that had been happening in this hall before she walked into it each month. Nobody had warned her that the sheriff of Caldwell, Kansas, was the kind of man who showed up 2 hours early and said what he meant with a piece of ribbon and then waited, without expectation or announcement, for the right person to understand it. But she had come to believe, over 7 years of evidence, that this was one of the fundamental truths she had encountered, that the most important things are sometimes not announced. Sometimes they are simply done, quietly, month after month, because the doer has decided that the person on the other end is worth the consistent and unpublicized effort of hope. She had sat in that chair 12 times before she understood what she was sitting in. She would sit in the equivalent of that chair, she thought, for the rest of her life, in the warmth of the thing that had been made for her without ceremony, the thing she had walked into not knowing what it was, the thing that had turned out to be, precisely and entirely, what she needed. She walked out of the hall into the November night with her husband beside her, and the stars over the Kansas prairie were brilliant and numerous, and the cold was clean, and the street was familiar, and somewhere on the way home William would need to be collected from Florence's house where he had been staying, and Clara would have opinions about supper, and Henry would need to be checked on, and Register the cat would be on the account books where he had no business being. And tomorrow the store would open, and the library would open, and the sheriff's office would open, and the town would go about its living. She took Joel's arm on the cold street. "The water system proposal," he said. "When do you think Abbott will move on the implementation?" "February at the earliest," she said. "But I've already drafted a schedule." He shook his head, fond and precise, and she felt the laugh in him through the arm she was holding, and they walked home together through the Caldwell night, under the enormous and faithful sky, into the life they had made.